So, with the recent videos detailing the first Matrix movie I made, I thought it would be natural to do a video on the philosophical problem relating to if we live in a simulation or not, as well as briefly introducing the philosophical topic of skepticism. This is of course one of the more popular questions that has risen both in philosophy as well as in the public sphere with some very famous introductions historically, such as the one given in Descartes' Meditations, for example. Another candidate of historic importance describes the allegory of Plato's cave, which details a group of prisoners chained within the confines of a cave, where their only means of reality perception is in the form of the stimulus given by the shadows being projected onto the cave wall by puppeteers operating from behind the prisoners, unbeknownst to these prisoners themselves. We then imagine that one of the prisoners manages to escape his cave existence and realizes that the shadows are indeed not real but rather have been artificially constructed. However, when he returns to tell the other prisoners, the prisoners themselves do not believe him and are in fact hostile to such notions to the degree that they ridicule him for it. Thus, there isn't any revelatory truth to be found in the account of the freed prisoner, it seems, but rather he sadly ends up being ostracized from the group as a whole for not partaking in the mass illusion which functions as an ontological replacement for the real world outside. Other similar narrations besides Plato's cave story from Plato's Republic might include a story which predates Plato, found in the Hindu religious text known as the Upanishads. We might here tell the story of the parable of Svetaketu. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. But anyways, this involves a comparable theme involving ignorance and enlightenment. The story centers around a boy, Svetaketu, who is sent by his father to study the Vedas, where the Vedas serve as another religious text found in Hinduism. After a duration of 12 years, the boy returns, having grown older and perhaps wiser, but finds that his father still insists upon that he has not learned any fundamental true understanding of the self. As a sort of challenge to elucidate the son's ignorance, we as readers get a parable in which Svetaketu's father, Uddalaka, gets his son to dump a piece of salt in some water. Naturally, the next day when the son returns, the salt has been dissolved such that Svetaketu cannot find the salt upon Uddalaka's request. The story thus brings into question the perceived reality of the apparently solid form of the salt, which he has validated through his senses, that nonetheless vanishes, bringing into question its very existence. Although it should be noted here that there is a stark difference between the stories of Plato's cave, which flirts with the idea of global skepticism, where none of our beliefs can ever be justified, while the conventional interpretation of Svetaketu's parable is usually seen in relation to a teaching of the self, or Atman, where this notion is seen as being ever-present, but not necessarily or immediately visible. Atman is thus ever-present, much like the salt that has been dissolved in the water, which cannot be separated by taste, i.e., no matter which portions of the matter one tastes the water from, it remains equally salt. Yet, the goal, as I understand it, is to perceive ultimate reality, or Brahman, as something that may just as easily elude our perceptions, but is in reality present in everything, much like the salt is ever present in the water, although we cannot see it. Furthermore, the connection with the East in regards to skepticism is something that deserves a lot more attention, as even among the most famous of skeptics, namely Pyrrho of Elis, of whom we recognize the name from the Pyrrhonian skeptics, did in fact accompany Alex the Great on his travels, it is believed, where it is said that Pyrrho traveled to the lands of India in the East. We get this source from the biographer of Diogenes Laertius, which showcases the influence of Eastern religion and philosophy on that of ancient Greek philosophical developments. As always, it is my opinion that global philosophy should get more recognition. But let's not get too off the tracks, where we will soon get into the meat of the question posed in the title of the video. I will therefore just briefly mention the point which is that I assumed for many that the prospect of not being able to justify any position or to have absolute confidence in any proposition is likely to give some sort of anxiety for a host of people. However, it was ironically a position to celebrate and even seen as a healthy predisposition towards life among the ancient skeptics. These skeptics were, after all, in philosophical competition against both the Epicureans and the Stoics in the Greek-Roman world, where we have figures such as the famous skeptic Sextus Empiricus, espousing to quote, "Skepticism has relieved two terrible diseases that afflicted mankind, anxiety and dogmatism." So, I inserted this map of the Roman Greco Empire around 200 AD, as you can see, as a reference here of the Roman Greek Empire around Empiricus' lifetime, although we should also keep in mind that Greek and Roman culture were distinct in many ways, such as adhering to different worldviews, for example. Anyways, getting back to the topic, I suppose one of the better arguments one could argue for in terms of seeing skepticism as something humbling in this regard would be to argue in favor in terms of a humbling disposition towards knowledge, where a PhD is no more likely to know something than a toddler when it comes to epistemic certainty. So I suppose that some may find this persuasive in regards to this position. Now, with that short historical introduction aside, let's discuss the problem that one faces when one comes head-to-head with the prospect that none of our beliefs can ever really be ultimately grounded and thereby justified. Where I promise we will get to the problem of our world being a simulation later in the video. We may start off by noting that isn't a lot of the endeavors concerning science, philosophy, or even our day-to-day life concerned with finding out the real truth of the matter or the absolute certainty of the matter? One response to this question, it seems to me, is to argue that, yeah, so what if we ultimately cannot ground our most basic beliefs and assumptions? For what is meant by truth or justification, depending on context, does not entail global certainty. That is, we are not so much concerned with offering axiomatic justifications for every conceivable proposition as we are in trying to provide certainty around issues in our everyday day-to-day lives. Our practice thus operates around various heuristics in which we try to determine the truth to the degree we have a certain confidence in that our beliefs are correct in relation to what we are trying to determine. This relates to a point brought up by the German philosopher known as Heidegger, who is often not entirely accurate put in the existentialist camp, where he argues in favor of a practical engagement with the world, where we rely upon a practical understanding of our external world, where one does not require absolute certainty in regards to justification. One could therefore argue in terms of a Heideggerian philosophy that, hey look, this mode of being undermines the skeptical demand for absolute certainty, where we could reference our own childhood upbringing, where it's pretty clear that we are not required to give absolute grounding to our personal inquiry of knowledge. It seems to me that from this perspective, we are navigating the world and classifying objects based on relations and categorizations, where we don't delve into the turtles all the way down approach in terms of justifying every conceivable grounding. Anyways, for more details on this position, I would recommend checking out his magnus opus book, Being in Time, where he challenges skepticism in regards to how this position fails to understand our actual mode of being through our practical engaged understanding of the world that weighs the implicit practices of our knowledge pursuits. Be warned though, it's a tough book to get through, where one might start off with his essay What is Metaphysics, or some of his other writings found in his basic writings book, or perhaps even better, some other introductory YouTube videos. Another response to the skeptic might be to argue that, hey, why do you even have an opinion on the matter if we live in a simulation or not? Or if you have an opinion on any other matter for that sake, as you cannot ultimately justify any of your claims. It seems the skeptic is inconsistent in his or her practice, in other words, in terms of claiming what we cannot know with global confidence in terms of a knowledge claim. We might therefore accuse the skeptic of adhering to some kind of epistemic circularity, wherein claiming that if no beliefs are justified, They are in essence making a claim about a global position which they cannot know anything about. For why should the belief that no beliefs are justified be an incorrigible belief, meaning that we cannot be wrong about it? This argument of skepticism being ultimately self-undermining is associated, among others, with the South African philosopher John McDowell, who argues from a point of knowledge where we attain knowledge from a web of beliefs, thereby rejecting the claim that there operates preconceptual givens that we must account for, and that knowledge must be based on an infallible foundationalism. Rather, the acquisition of justification is a learned process through sensory experiences, where we as human beings acquire and develop a nest of concepts through enculturation. The skeptic is then making an error in claiming to give a secure foundation that all of our beliefs are non-justified, when this secure foundation stems from a given that is non-inferential, non-conceptual, where McDowell questions the whole framework of how we could ever be certain of such beliefs according to his framework of knowledge. We could also detail here an easier response to the problem of skepticism, which comes from the famed Austrian philosopher known as Karl Popper, who said that while we can never be absolutely certain in regards to scientific knowledge, a position known as fallibilism, we can nonetheless have robust falsifiable knowledge, where we here choose to place a strong emphasis on falsifying theories. Actually, Popper can be further said to have tried and sidestepped the problem of induction laid forth by Hume earlier by appealing to science as a deductive enterprise, where theories are never confirmed, but they can certainly be falsified. One can think of this in Modens-Tollens terms, where if not Q, then not P must be true automatically, or if the ground is not wet, then we can conclude that it has not rained. Note here that the conditional case, which is not true, is only satisfied for P, then not Q. This can be checked easily using a truth table if you are still uncertain. Lastly, let's look at a response from a branch of epistemology known as Hinge epistemology, associated with another Austrian philosopher, namely Wittgenstein, where some further ideas have been developed by the philosopher Pritchard, which includes a notion of über-Hinge commitments. These commitments comprise a series of basic foundational beliefs that are assumed as taken for granted, much analogous to how we grant certain mathematical axioms in the practice of mathematics. In fact, these assumptions are so basic as while we assume according to the Wittgensteinian view that we need basic hinge propositions, much like a door needs hinges in order to function at all, the über-hinges are thought to be what provides ultimate grounds for our belief and knowledge claims. Although these remain ultimately unproven, hence assumptions, as with axioms, we should, according to Pritchard, feel confident to take these at face value, as they are necessary in order for epistemic practices to even get going. We might then argue here that having a belief in the reality of the external world, then our general faculties and the possibilities of other minds are prerequisites for engaging in any knowledge-seeking activity. I suppose, simplified, we could say that we need a world in order to have any evidence at all according to this viewpoint. Alright, now with some of the arguments against skepticism discussed, let's delve into how a skeptic might respond to some of these arguments before moving on to discuss the simulation hypothesis. For instance, consider the case of Popper, who it feels like in general was a lot more popular with scientists than with philosophers. We can argue against his certainty regarding falsification. One of the biggest challenges, as was brought up by a lot of philosophical critics, is that Popper in no way escapes the problem of induction. For Popper, as we remember, he tried to argue for a deductive variant of science, where we are simply in the business of falsifying theories, fully admitting that we cannot ever prove a theory to be true, as this would require an infinite number of trials. However, the very process of falsification relies upon pre-existing elements of other theories being true, and moreover, not just elements of other theories being true, but also our whole sensory apparatus, as we have to trust our faculties of observation, our eyes, and our overall faculty of reasoning as it presents itself to us as a series of mental states in regards to perception. In other words, here it seems that there is a whole lot of underdetermination of the general framework of which falsification operates along the lines of with regards to Popper. We use underdetermination here, taken as the idea that the available evidence might be insufficient in relation to the conclusion one wants to draw here. We might also add here that Popper's methods does not really address the notion of radical skepticism, where we might only imagine how he would respond to, say, a brain in a vat scenario, i.e. a scenario put forth by Putnam and Harman, which details all of our experiences being reduced to a stimulated brain in a vat. In other words, he takes the external world representation as a given, where for Popper there is always a reality existing independently, which we can use to test against in terms of his loved conjectures and falsification schema which he developed. For those interested, I would highly recommend his book, Conjectures and Refutations. I also have to get around to reading The Logic of Scientific Discovery in more detail, having not finished it yet. Alright, so what about experiences serving as an example as to what to look for in terms of justification, as detailed by Heidegger earlier? So, can we do any better here? Well, I'm afraid the skeptic is going to insist that the pre-theoretical understanding that Heidegger wants to dismay is not as pre-theoretic as one wants it to be. One could, for instance, argue that, hey, look, a large part of what it means to be human is to cast doubt around oneself and its surroundings, so why can't this consideration be weighted as well in our practical engagement with epistemology? Furthermore, one can argue that the whole enterprise of Heideggerian thinking is too relativized, and if we want to challenge the notion of multiple definitions, which all are in conflict with each other as serving as legitimate under this relativized knowledge schema, then we need a more objective framework to work with. The only problem here is that we then automatically fall back on the problem of skepticism, which we tried to avoid in the first place. This problem of relativism in terms of knowledge is something that is often brought up, as it relates how differing subjects may hold contradicting or highly incongruent notions regarding knowledge, where there is no clear way of adjudicating which view is correct according to critics. Turning the table around now, we might ponder how the skeptic is going to respond to the charge of the problem of undermining raised earlier. Well, one response might be to argue in favor of all the ways our cognitive faculties fail us in terms of illusions, hallucinations, biases, and other perceptual errors, where we argue that it is reasonable to extrapolate based upon this, that our cognitive machinery is indeed very likely to be mistaken, and that philosophers such as McDowell overestimates our capacity for rational thought, as well as the legitimacy of empirical observations and practice. Although I don't think that here that the skeptic gets fully away with their insistence of making a global claim in regards to the global failure of justification, where we might argue that this statement itself hinges on the legitimacy of negating a proposition, i.e. that the classical laws of logic apply globally. I would therefore be interested in how the skeptic might respond to this argument further. So, having looked at some responses from the skeptic, we now move on to some objections from the sciences in regards to the simulation hypothesis. After all, we can't be philosophy boys all the time. Here, one naturally gives a sort of primacy to the physical evidence in the case for and against a simulation existing. I suppose this sort of argument relies upon the brilliant track record fields such as the typical STEM sciences, as well as, say, mathematics, has had in the past, in order to justify that such arguments are especially warranted when it comes to evaluating the possibility whether we in fact live in a simulation or not. It should be noted that it is very common among scientists as well to adhere to a strong form of scientific realism, where for physicists, one strongly believes that physical laws are both real in the sense of being mind-independent, as well as it's possible for us as scientists to discover such laws. In addition, the fact that such an argument, when presented well in terms of experimental as well as theoretical evidence, may be hard for us to dismiss at first glance when it comes to scientific theory determination. I suppose one argument in favor in terms of a simulation would be to argue that since we know so little about our universe in terms of empirical observations in relation to the overwhelming size of the universe, which for all we know could be infinite, which is argued among some cosmologists, for instance, then we should at the very least take the simulation hypothesis seriously. Another host of proponents may be found for those who subscribe to an information theory view of the universe. That is, since according to this view, our universe can be described in terms of information and bits, then it seems easier under this view to understand how a potential simulated world ontology might operate in terms of a complex series of computations, bits, and information, all strung together like a nice ribbon. One objection, however, we might raise here to this hypothesis from a scientific perspective would be to say, look, we don't think that a simulation is the best hypothesis for understanding our universe, where we could argue that we don't at present understand nearly enough of human consciousness as to ascertain whether consciousness could be simulated or not. And even if we grant that it did, then this still leaves open the door as to how we are going to give a complete, faithful, simulated representation of the universe in its full complexity as we understand it at present. For the first point, there can thus arise issues if it turns out that, for example, some form of reductive physicalism turns out to be true, where we need neurons as well as complex biological systems to generate consciousness. To rely on non-physical substrates and computation, these simply fail in this case if this view is indeed correct, such that one can argue from this vantage point as an example. We could also easily imagine other restrictions such as metabolism being needed or other physical processes, which sets a barrier for the simulation hypothesis to get started at all. Furthermore, we might make an appeal to some conceptual parsimony where we do not posit any unnecessary entities, where for the scientist the hypothesis muddles the water in a large way by assuming other highly intelligent civilizations running simulations, as well as stipulations regarding the reduction of consciousness. One often also assumes an abundance of civilizations, as well as simulations, which has led philosophers such as Nick Bostrom, for example, to conclude that a simulation is more likely than the alternative. But why should we be under the assumption that 1. Life is easily started, 2. Life often does not die out easily, and 3. There exists an abundance of civilizations whose current technological output is vastly ahead of ours at present. In regards to the second point mentioned above, where let's say we grant for the sake of argument that we can simulate consciousness, then there is still the challenge of reproducibility of our foundational physics, which it is not at present not at all obvious that we can just simulate. For if an accurate representation of both quantum physics and general relativity is needed, then the barriers seems high for the proponents of the simulation hypothesis, since it is not at all clear that even quantum computers would even be able to reproduce such theories faithfully in the future or at present. There are complex fundamental theories in physics such as the Standard Model, which describes 3 of the 4 fundamental forces excluding gravitation, where the technical issues regarding the model, along with future refined models from physics, may be simply infeasible to reproduce, where the proponent of the simulation hypothesis needs to account for the technicalities for overcoming such barriers, it seems to me. One may, for instance, ask, what if there is a need to simulate an accurate representation of a Hilbert space, an inner product space in which every Cauchy sequence converges, which is itself may extend to the infinite dimensional, then this cannot be done with finite computers. Are we then to assume that there are all these amazing approximations running of our best physical models in the background? If this is the case, then it's probable that there are also compression algorithms running, but then these should be empirically verified, which at present there does not seem any sound empirical evidence to suggest. We might imagine how strange of a picture this would constitute if there were in existence different compressions of natural phenomena in our world around us. Hence, we could state that the reproducibility in terms of a simulated universe seems to be a very hard challenge for the simulation enthusiast to meet as current. It's certainly far from something one could state with strong epistemic certainty at present, it seems to me. We might therefore conclude that in terms of research programs, the simulation hypothesis is at current severely underdeveloped, as it at present has not met the burden of proof in terms of severe empirical testing, testable novel predictions, etc. But hey, some proponents will also tell you that it's at present formulated as a hypothesis for this reason, among others, but a hypothesis one should take seriously nonetheless. So that wraps up the video. I realize here that I might have spent more time on the simulation hypothesis itself and make it a standalone video, but I thought it was very worthwhile to introduce the topic of skepticism as well. Anyways, I sincerely hope they got something out of it, and I might make more videos exploring the subject if it's something you are interested in. Let me know in the comments section. Please leave a like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Cheers!